Hello, everybody. Welcome to my top five takeaways from The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I was thinking about what to speak on, and so I've selected for you kind of my top five to think about. So, just to recap here in terms of the plot, we know that The Handmaid's Tale is about a dystopian society called Gilead that was formed in the 21st century when Christian fundamentalists seized power. So, all citizens, especially women, live under an oppressive theocratic regime whose rise to power has been facilitated by a number of related crises, a dangerously polluted natural world, uh, uh, concomitant population decline caused by sterility, and rampant sexual promiscuity and permissiveness. And so the elite of the ruling hierarchy have commandeered fertile women, so, especially because male infertility is denied, right, as a thing. So, and they're using them for use as forced concubines, right? They are called handmaids and they are robbed of their identities and even their given names. So, the protagonist narrator of Atwood's stories, the handmaid Offred, was stripped of her own name, forced to bear the name of her master Fred, thus Offred, and made to endure his ritualized sexual attentions. And Offred's narrative reveals the terror of living under a regime of brute power. It's a complicated network of spying that deprives people of all privacy and personal freedom and resistance to the approved ideology that can result in death, or I should say, resistance to this ideology can result in death. And so the sexual behavior of all the citizens is regulated by repressive rules, but these are routinely flouted by the regime's rulers who also enjoy the state sanctioned use of concubines. And so a lot of themes permeate the literary landscape of this text, whether they're thinking about a dystopian society and how it got there, in terms of the motifs of motherhood. The lens of feminism, if we're going to talk about even any kind of religious structure that comes into this. So it's a complex narrative that has different kind of avenues and facets for analysis. So let's just look at a few of them here. So first up, my top takeaway, and I'm sure a lot of you noticed, is this notion of the unreliable narrator. And this is a fun one for me to look at because, as someone who reads Gothic horror literature and teaches a lot of Gothic and Victorian texts as well, that is a stylistic element that is very common in British literature, but other literary paradigms that play on the novel, right? Like on the advent of the novel with Robinson Crusoe is like the first, supposedly the first novel, right, that we're looking at, or official novel in British literature and English literature. It's interesting to think about the reliability of our narrator because we know that there's so many different kinds of mediations of her narrative, particularly considering the historical notes. So it's interesting that here Atwood uses a device to echo the use of the journal that is prevalent in many dystopian works, right? So in our reading, you'll see it in We. You'll also see that in 1984 outside of the reading. But of course, as part of the genre of dystopian literature, journaling, note taking, this diary entry, this is definitely part of the dystopian aspect of like the secret thoughts not regulated by the state. And we certainly see that here in The Handmaid's Tale. And we know that Atwood was influenced by 1984. She penned the text in 1984, harkening back to 1948 when we had Orwell writing 1984, right? So she's really thinking about like we are in the year that Orwell had projected and had been talking about. And like, so what does it look like, or what is our response in terms of the issues that we're going to critique? Or when I say we, I mean her, right? So like what is she's saying here? So this device denies the idea of historicity by having the action, even the past action, unfold in an internal now, right? Like even though we know it's in the past, it's like we're there present as it's unfolding in the way that she's writing, rather than in a closed and finished then. In autobiographical studies, this is the difference between the narrating I and the narrated I. So we are actually in the present, conscious of the way that the text is being written through the hand of the narrating I, or the I, the author who is constantly fashioning her autobiographical text and her words, right? Whether that's journaling, whether that's recording, right on tapes, and versus the narrated I, which is usually the I that you get after the process of writing is over. In most memoirs, you get a very polished, revised I that is constantly looking back and saying, "This is what it was like then." So the narrating I tends to use the present and draw attention to the fact that they are creating a narrative about the self. And so that's what's really interesting here. And if you're interested in the narrating I versus the narrated I, Sydney Smith and Julia Watson, affectionately known as Smith and Watson in autobiographical theory and literature, have written a compilation book of autobiographical studies called Autobiography, a Study. And so their work is really helpful, and you can find that actually digitally through the NSC library. So when Ofra does use the past tense, she uses it in relation to her life before the Gileadian regime in our now, our present, right? So, and then our present, of course, is also Offred's past when we're going back to read this. So there are these just really interesting temporal layers. Offred also repeatedly acknowledges the contingency of her own narrative, acknowledging that despite her use of the present tense, she is not experiencing events but recounting them, right? So this is a reconstruction, she tells us, and this is what's on the slide. All of it is a reconstruction. She acknowledges that she has silently expanded Moira's account. There isn't supposed to be a dash there, but it just kind of slipped in. So Moira's account of her attempted escape, although she asserts that I've tried to make it sound as much like her as I can. She provides multiple narratives of Luke's fate, claiming to believe them all. Quote, "The things I believe can't all be true, though one of them must be, but I believe in all of them." And she provides multiple versions of her first sexual encounter with Nick and finally concludes, quote, "I'm not sure how it happened, not exactly." End quote. Even her final words provide no definitive truth. And so at the end, right, and it's so I step up into the darkness within or else the light, right? And that's what we're left with. And so that is Offred's account is clearly experiential, a reflection of our own thoughts and perspectives rather than an objective and historical report. Like we just don't know what to believe or what's happening here. And it speaks to the trauma because this also taps into memory and trauma studies and the way in which trauma and receiving trauma can definitely conflict and impact your memory and your ability to remember. And so this is what is happening for her. Her narrative strategies consistently stress the failure of any single reading of an event to be valid. Indeed, they challenge the very notion of a textually fixed historical truth. So, Offred comments at various points, for instance, on the failure of text to provide convincing pictures of reality or to account for the female experience in her world. She has said about the newspapers in Gilead, quote, "The newspaper stories were like bad dreams to us. How awful we would say, and they were, but they were awful without being believable." Right? And that, end quote, such accounts of rape and mutilation of women, in her view, quote, "interfered with, as they used to say," right, end quote, are supposedly factual and objective, but nevertheless feel melodramatic and do not seem real in the context of the lives lived by Offred and her friends prior to the Gileadian takeover. And the texts do not capture their experiences, right? She says they were about other women, and the men who did such things were other men, right, end quote. Instead, Offred says, quote, "We were the people who were not in the papers. We lived in the blank white spaces at the edges of print. We lived in the gaps between the stories." Right. And that's interesting because that really speaks to marginalized identity, the gaps between stories. For instance, if you've taken my classes before or are aware, you will know the work of Gayatri Spivak, who had famously talked about measure the silences as a feminist methodology when looking at women in colonial and post colonial societies and how they may have been silenced. So she looked at Sati widow burnings in India, where you had the British Raj go into India and try to regulate everything and create all these laws. And then they saw that in the Hindu custom, of a man dying, of a husband dying, when he would do so in certain villages and communities, their widows would then cast themselves on the funeral pyre, the same as the husbands who had just departed because they would not spend this life without their husband. And what Gayatri Spivak, who is a professor of comparative literature at Columbia University, who famously wrote in her article, Can the Subaltern Speak? She answers this question that if you're truly subaltern and marginalized, you cannot. Because when she went to look at archives and looked at what the British Raj had written about the women, she had found that there was a record there indeed that they had said we had investigated and deemed this to be a really barbaric practice and we outlawed it. There were even records of the men, like the Hindu Indian men who were interviewed, and they said, but this is a cultural and religious right. We must be allowed to continue this. What Gayatri Spivak, of course, found was that there was no record from the women. No one had bothered to ask what the women thought about these Sati widow burnings, for better or for worse. Did they agree? Did they disagree? We will never know because there was no record. So, this is a methodology that you can actually use. You can measure the gaps in silences to determine who is speaking and who is not speaking, who is silenced or who is so traumatized and subaltern that they cannot speak. And that's a very useful methodology. So, accounts of female experiences are partial and limited in this world, right? They leave much out, perhaps more than is included. And the reality or a significant portion of it exists outside the text. So the text provides only stories, not the entire story here. So Gilead represents perhaps the most extreme example of textual reductionism, for it reduces all experiences to a single perspective, a single story, and not even an unadulterated one. For the scriptures that serves as the basis of Gileadian society are read selectively and even modified, right? As Offred recognizes at different times, one example is the version of the Beatitudes recited at lunch at the Red Center. Quote, Blessed be the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the merciful, blessed are the meek, blessed are the silent. I knew they made that up. I knew it was wrong, and they left things out too, but there was no way of checking, right? That's an end quote. That's the quote from the text. So the Gileadians combine a belief in the authoritative power of a text to determine truth with the power who control the text to alter it to suit their needs. That is um, of their practice of the failure of text as text, free from the power of the interpreter to determine or even reflect truth. And you can even think about this further mediation, of course, as we know, of the narrative in the historical notes. We know that Professor Peixoto and his colleagues have had to go in and mediate this story and actually, really revise it and create this whole narrative around it, right? So this is what the unreliable narrator here can suggest. Or the way that we have this story is this kind of fragmented, partial story that speaks to marginalization and trauma. I will say, as part of this, what is super interesting um, is the way in which you have these kinds of juxtapositions of that mediation, by the way, and what it speaks to in terms of telling one story and even some of the aspects. Of like the continuation of this patriarchal world. So I wanted to actually kind of slip this in here in this particular part, but this could, this close reading of the word chair can kind of float in and out through any of these slides. But I decided to group it here because Offred, by contrast, attempts to find the truth in multiple subjective perspectives. And that is in contrast to the end of the historical notes, right? Like, as they're kind of just piecing things together. I thought this is really interesting to think about how she gradually recognizes that she can manipulate language in order to create her own subjectivity, and a subjectivity that can enable her to act as a subversive agent against the oppressive reality created by the Republic of Gilead. So her own litanies contrast with those imposed by the Gileadian regime, as we see in her reflections on the word chair. I sit in the chair and think about the word chair. It can also mean the leader of a meeting. It can also mean a mode of execution. It is the first syllable in charity. It is the French word for flesh. None of these facts has any connection with the others. These are the kinds of litanies I use to compose myself. So that's interesting, right? Thinking about this, like what is, particularly as it relates to the symbol of Scrabble and how it comes up as a thread throughout the text, and thinking about words and their multiple meanings, and of course, like the way that words are mediated, highly mediated throughout the Gileadian world, right? Particularly as they relate to names, which I'll be talking about in this lecture as well. So while Offred insists on the multiple yet distinct meanings the word carries, Professor Peixoto plays on the multiple meanings of the word chair to collapse them, thus making a sexual and sexist pun at the expense of Marianne Crescent Moon. Right, in this new world, 200 years later at his conference, we see that patriarchy or these kind of patriarchal slippages or sexist remarks are still alive and well. Right? And he says, I am sure we all enjoyed our charming Arctic char last night at dinner, and now we are enjoying an equally charming Arctic chair. I use the word enjoy in two distinct senses, precluding, of course, the obsolete third, and then there's laughter, right? And so for Peixoto and for his audience, as the laughter indicates, joking about Marianne Crescent Moon's sexual appeal, she's good enough to eat, is acceptable, and is indicative of his reductive and simplistic view. And unlike similar Gileadian litanies of singular, unequivocal conformity, Offred's litanies are personal, multivocal, and self defining. They are her mode of self composition. Indeed, to some extent, Offred liberates herself from her oppressive reality by transforming it into fiction. I would like to believe this is a story I'm telling. I need to believe it. I must believe it, right? This is what she says. Those who can believe that such stories are only stories have a better chance. It's a story I'm telling, then I have control over the ending. Then there will be an ending to the story, and real life will come after it. I can pick up where I left off. It isn't a story I'm telling. It's also a story I'm telling in my head as I go along. So, and this is her speaking in the text. So by fictionalizing, by thinking of her experiences as those in a story, by inventing multiple possibilities, Offred can come to terms to some extent with what is happening to her. Her life is not a story, but a genuine sequence of experiences. But it is also a story in the sense that a sequence of experiences given meaning and context by a process of self-composition. The truth can reside more in the story that Offred constructs or reconstructs than it does in the facts, right? So it is a type of story here. And as I said, the historical notes section further undermines the historical authority of Offred's account by revealing that the text of the novel is not the direct record made by Offred of her experiences, but is itself a construct, a transcript of tape recorded commentaries edited and structured and interpreted by its 22nd century editors who have in a way repeated the very process that Offred herself uses, but with a very different agenda. In effect, our entire experience of Offred's account has been deceptive. For we have been reading it, but it is not a document at all, but a series of recorded audio tapes. And the text we have read is a documentary study, a transcription edited by male scholars, not an unmediated account of Offred's experiences. It is a retrospectively organized interpretation of that account. And all that we have assumed about the text we have been reading, including the authority of the order in which the events are narrated, is violated by historical notes, or read that his notes, right? Like his historical notes. And the voice we thought we were listening to is subsumed, even fictionalized by Peixoto, right? And this is why we have that ending. It's to further collapse the narrator on itself. Like, how reliable can a narrator be from this dystopian space, right? We know it's not going to end well. either way, even if she escapes, like this world is going to collapse in on itself at some point if we're reading it. So we know that there are going to be some slippages. It also speaks to this idea of the fear of speaking out, right? In these dystopian societies, often you have a KGB-esque monitoring, right? That Big Brother is watching, as in 1984, and this is what Orwell was really worried about, was like the Soviet era, as we see in Animal Farm, as well as like these kinds of fascist societies. But certainly, we know this to be the case, even in America. I mean, look no further than what Edward Snowden had done in exposing the clear PRISM program, of that compound, I believe it is in Utah, that's really recording everything that we do and keeping these records, and potentially using them against citizens down the line. So it would be, very naive to think that we are not in some way, having like multiple digital records of everything that we're doing at this point. I mean, not to make you paranoid here, but it is something that's ongoing and it's happening now. And you shouldn't be assuming that it's not happening. Okay, another takeaway I wanted to look at was the inspiration. I thought this is super interesting. When you kind of delve into, interviews with Margaret Atwood and what she was interested in, here's a little bit of what I found. When she was writing the book, she took inspiration from, among other things, the rise of the Christian right in America during the 1970s and 80s, the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, and the much less well known, a woman in 17th century New England named Mary Webster, who was one of the people she dedicated the book to and whom she later wrote a poem about. Atwood and Professor Bridget Marshall tell us the story of Mary Webster, who's better known as Half Hanged Mary, in a series of interviews that I've also posted as well. So I wanted to kind of have a reference to what I put online in the modules for you. And so it's super interesting to think about Half Hanged Mary and her connection. Her aunt is like, well, are we related? Are we not related? And she's taking it as like, no, I think we're related. I'm really interested in America's puritanical past, because even though Margaret Atwood is Canadian and has been there for a few generations, like going back originally, her family was from America, and colonial America at that. And so I've included a couple pieces that I thought was interesting, because I think the show to some degree must be aware of this. Because if you look at the slide, and I'm not sure how much you're going to be able to see my mouse here, but I love that the TV show was thinking about this and had this kind of like symbol for New Gilead, which when I saw it, I was like, oh my God, this is the Allah symbol in Arabic and the Iranian Islamic flag. After 1979, the flag got changed with the Shira Shamshir or Shira Khorshid, which is the sun and the lion flag that used to be in the middle of it. And it was a very monarchical flag. And it got changed into a religious one, where this is actually Persian, like Arabic script, over and over again. And all of this is speaking to um, Allah and God. It's a theocracy, right? And so these symbol, I mean, for me, this is like, whoa, like, they just kind of made that person here of this, but what they may not realize is that this is in the Perso-Arabic script, if you will, with that um, Aleph, Lam, Aleph, which is what makes Allah, if you will, there. And so it says same symbol. So here's like that kind of direct harkening back. And then, of course, in the clothing, because there were questions about that as well. I mean, you have the bonnets that she's so interested in, and some of like the uniforms, that you'll see in the later sketches that I include of the red clothing of the handmaids, as a variation of this, but like as one piece, right? So it's just like all long sleeve, one piece, a dress that comes out that way with the boots. It's all matching. And then there was some indication for some folks that she was also inspired by the chador, which had always been used in Islamic countries and Iran as well prior to 1979 the revolution, but became more and more popular as um, the veil became compulsory in Iran after the revolution to signal that. And so some people will wear headscarf and just like kind of like an overcoat, to qualify as religious dress, under the penal codes in Iran. And to this day, you do have to veil if you go there. I do certainly whenever I go. You just have to, or it's against the law. And then there are those who are very religious who feel like they're going to wear the chador, which is mostly black, but it can be multicolors. And it's a specific type of cloth that is lightweight that's used to kind of cover over whatever clothing is underneath, and you just kind of hold it under your chin. But it's designed to not really show the shape of the body, which over here on the left hand side, in our picture, that most resembles, some of like what the women wear in The Handmaid's Tale, or what's described as what they're wearing. Might show a little bit of their body. Of course, the chador speaks a little bit more to what's here. In the top image from the TV show, this kind of like, it actually looks kind of Soviet era as well, those Soviet colors that are kind of drab, but an overcoat, because the idea is you're not trying to elicit the male gaze, right? So instead of putting the onus on men and saying, hey, you shouldn't be objectifying the female body, the onus is put onto women in these two societies, whether it's Iran or Gilead, and saying, okay, you've got to cover up because otherwise you're kind of asking for it. And that's referred to a lot in reference to the world in which we live now, that Margaret Atwood is critiquing, and Offred is looking at. She's like, in that world before, it's like, and if we, go out into those punishments, like she was asking for it, right? Like she's the one to blame. And so this is really coming from a sexist environment. What I will say though is, beyond that, the parallels to Iran, like for a lot of people who want to say it's like so parallel, it collapses. And I can tell you this from research and personal experience, because it's complicated after the 1979 revolution. Because by all rights, the record shows, particularly like if you look at UN studies, literacy goes up exponentially. And in fact, in Iran, it's said that about 90% of the population is literate, which contrasts to the pre revolutionary, pre 1979 numbers, where only about half the country is literate. It also greatly contrasts to the neighboring countries around Iran that don't show such a high literacy rate. Furthermore, women become increasingly a larger percentage of colleges and universities. They had been going before, but they were not necessarily in high numbers, and they become a higher participating percentage of the workforce in Iran to this day. So, in a lot of ways, like a lot opened up for women in Iran, but then again, it has to be along party lines, right? And actually, I should say a lot opened up for women of lower classes. So, upper class women prior to the revolution had access to everything. They were going into education, they were working, they had their money, they had all those things. But if you were, lower class in particular, lower socioeconomic level, it was harder for you to gain an entry, seat into college and all of that, and to go there. So after the revolution, it opens up, and you have lower socioeconomic, class-based Iranians who are able to go to college and enter the workforce, have higher levels of literacy and participation in society, especially for those who felt that they were more religious and had been somewhat ostracized for veiling through much of the 20th century during the Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavis who had been ruling. So I don't want to go down too much into this rabbit hole, but of course you can probably tell I'm very passionate about this and researched so much about Iran that when I went and looking at interviews as well as lectures from professors online about it, I was kind of dismayed to see that they hadn't done their homework about Iran. It's not quite what they think it is. Women aren't oppressed per se, right? Like they are driving. This isn't Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia would be a more apt example. If anything, women are allowed to do really pretty much everything. It just follows more of a Soviet paradigm, where if you speak against the regime, and that's anyone, it's not just, like specific to women. If anyone speaks against the regime, you are severely punished, right? And it depends, what that punishment varies depending on the crime. And so you don't have a free speech in Iran, and you really didn't have it so much before the 1979 revolution, although one could argue that it was before. Before the revolution, you did have more so. So it's very, I think as Western feminists look at Iran, they see the chador and they're like oppressed. And I want to tell you that actually the chador and veiling allowed a very conservative religious population of Iran to go back out into society and to participate And so for them, it has been wonderful, right? But for those who feel like they don't want to veil and it's compulsory, it's very confining. Also, when we get to themes of motherhood and support for women, there's actually a lot more support, as I mentioned in the discussion post. There is more support in Iran than in America, for instance, for women because they are given 6 months paid maternity leave. When they come back, they are allowed to, set their schedule. They're allowed to go home multiple times a day for, breast milk feeding. They are allowed to use birth control. That is absolutely allowed in Iranian society and in Islam as opposed to Catholicism. And so people are very much in charge of their family and family planning. They also have rights to divorce. Like, this is something I saw in some coverage about this, that women don't have the right, but actually in Islam, immediately, and it does take Sharia law in Iran, but immediately a woman can declare her right to divorce by saying it 3 times and demand her mehriye, bride price that was agreed upon, like a settlement, if you will, and say, I want that immediately, even without a divorce, like the money that we decided, and then she can initiate her divorce. So, some of these things that I see out there, just remember, especially about Iran, because it has been a kind of closed society, not necessarily behind an iron curtain, but operating much the same way. If you're not familiar, it's very easy to judge from a Western feminist perspective and call everybody outdated and backward. And I just want to tell you, it's just simply not the case. Even so, Atwood is looking at all this, and the point is, she's looking at the Christian right, she's looking at what's happening in Iran, and she's like, okay, this is an exercise of a theocratic country. What would this look like, this society, and what would be the effect on women? Also, I will say there is further proof of that because at the end in the historical notes, Professor Peixoto, who says, at the end it says, who scarcely needs an introduction as he is well known to all of us, is not personally then through his if not personally, then through his extensive publications. These include Sumptuary Laws Through the Ages, an analysis of documents, and the well-known study Iran and Gilead, two late 20th century monotheocracies as seen through diaries. Which is also interesting because I work a lot on memoirs and diaries, and I'm like, oh, actually, that would be cool to go and look at 1979 Revolutionary Diaries. So that's really planted a seed for me. But we know that she is thinking about this comparison because it's there in the historical notes, anyways. Like, you don't even have to look for an interview. So, all right. Takeaway number 3, the hierarchy. I thought this would be good to just touch upon. That men occupy positions of authority in this world, right? We know this is a very patriarchal world. Women serve and obey and have names appropriate to their subordinate status. So the classes of women include wives of commanders, concubines or handmaids, household servants known as Marthas, wives of lower class men called econo wives, and lowest in the hierarchy, unwomen, right? Old women and unrepentant nuns who clean up contaminated waste dumps and battlefields and who are sent to the colonies. So the last two terms, econo wives and unwomen, have no biblical antecedents, but nonetheless exemplify the importance of naming in producing the novel's effect. So the name, Econo Wives, which brings to mind the term economy car, right, an all purpose but low cost model, is indicative of their husbands' lack of status. So the cleverness of the coinage also reminds us that advertising executives, as we learn in the epilogue, are among the rulers of this society as they create this. So unwomen is another striking name and suggests that women unwilling or unfit to serve men are not women or persons at all. And so that makes sense. I found like a little bit of an image here that's talking about the commanders, the wives, the eyes, the angels, the guardians, and kind of looking through another set of hierarchies here. And of course, there's that image of the, handmaids as they're imagined with that like kind of like almost like that's almost like a Dutch nuns habit at the top there, or again like this kind of bonnet from like a puritanical world that's left over. So that hierarchy is very intentional, and please remember that the advertising execs, like I just imagine Mad Men creating this world, right? Like, just we're going to sit here and think about what this is, because if we're talking about this on an image level, we know, especially if you have seen Mad Men, that there is this kind of like reinforcement of gender roles as it can relate to advertising and selling of something, of marketing, because it's like, look, this will make you feel more like a woman, this will make you feel more like a man, because it appeals to us on an emotional level, and so it's that much more effective. So I just find that absolutely fascinating. The last kind of or what I will also say, the last two, like takeaway 4 and 5, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on. Naming as a motif. I really love this idea of naming throughout the text, right? And here's a really great quote from Margaret Atwood in an interview called Tightrope Walking. She said, "I'm very interested in their names. By that I mean their names don't always readily spring to mind. I have to go looking for their names. I would like not to have to call them anything, but they usually have to have names. Then the question is, if they are going to have names, the names have to be appropriate. Therefore, I spend a lot of time reading up on meanings of names in books like Name Your Baby." And this is actually in reference to all of our characters and all of our texts. It's not just The Handmaid's Tale, but I thought this is interesting, and I took this still from the text, right? Like Moira is there from the show, excuse me. So let's think about naming a little bit, like Offred, right? The offered one, if you will. But Offred, and then potentially even June, because it's been posited that her name is June. So Atwood is equally painstaking in her choice of the personal or given names of their characters in The Handmaid's Tale. And so by reading these names carefully and considering them in conjunction with biblical names in particular, we can construct a fable like or archetypal tale of victimization of the weak by the powerful. So the protagonist is known as Offred, a name imposed by the regime. And the practice of calling her by a name that indicates which man she belongs to, and of course epitomizes her objectification. Now remember, she had two other names prior to this. Well, actually three technically. She had her like given name in her pre-Gileadian world, which is never revealed. And then she had name number 2, which is the first time that she belonged to a man as this kind of handmaid concubine surrogacy. And then her third name, which is another time that she had an unsuccessful pregnancy, because remember, this is round 3. And then she has her fourth name of Offred or of Fred, right? So it also bears a similarity to Offred. I don't know if you've done that, right? Like where you see Offred and you immediately your eyes and your head fills in the gaps and rescrambles that to mean offered. And she's indeed offered or given away with no control over her fate. And as the handmaids are transferred from one posting to another, their given names change. And the significance of their namelessness, their interchangeability in the eyes of their masters, is made especially clear in one incident involving the handmaid with whom Offred is paired for daily in her shopping excursion. So this woman of Glen, who has been active in the underground, suddenly disappears. Right? We learn that her underground activities have been discovered, and fearing that under torture she may incriminate others, she kills herself. So Offred goes to meet her at the prearranged street corner and is met by her replacement. When the frightened Offred asks, has of Glen been transferred so soon? And then the replacement replies, I am of Glen. Right? So that's like really creepy. And we're like, oh, shoot, here she is. They're replaceable, they're interchangeable. That is the significance of the naming here. So Offred does have a given name, though she refers to it only once, and then so obliquely that few readers even notice it. But then there's a lot of actually debate about this. So there's one school of thought that says, she is actually June. So just bear with me here. So she treasures her real name, associating it with her selfhood and individuality. And we do know that. And she fantasizes about being called by her own name, and she says that she tells it to her lover Nick. And we know that what this name is, or at least can infer, we might be able to infer it, I should say. So at one point, there is a school of thoughts that says it must be June because the name June is mentioned in the list of names whispered from bed to bed in the training center early in the novel, around page 5. And we hear nothing subsequently about anybody named June, although the other names, Alma, Janine, Dolores, and Moira belong to characters who figure in later episodes of the story. We understand who they are. And actually, June, from the Latin for Junius, is a name of an important Roman family. It's also the most popular of the names based on the months of the year, which suggests youth and innocence. And thus, the name and its loss are quite appropriate, since Offred, maybe even as June, could be said to represent despoiled innocence or victimized womanhood. So June has been posited many articles in many circles as Offred's real name. But we do have a definitive interview from Atwood, and I believe it's even in the audio notes of the audiobook. I'm not quite sure because I'd listened to so many different interviews and of her speaking. She says actually she never revealed the name in the text, and she did not mean for Offred's name to be June. That was just an example, but she likes it. She's like, you know what? It fits, and I like this second reading. So, this is an example exactly of like the author is dead scholarship. Of course, you can look at what Margaret Atwood has said and what she intended, but if you can make a compelling argument about the text and argue your own point, you could say that like, no, her name here is June, and this is why it was whispered, and da 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 da, and kind of offer that close reading. To which even Atwood has conceded, this is really nice. Like, let's go with it. So this is what's really interesting. Um, about it. And if we continue even further about names, if we, fast forward to the ending of the narrative and naming, I think it's really interesting about the new world that we get post Gilead 200 years later, because we know from the notes and the way that it sounds, the symposium is somewhere far in the note. For far in the north, excuse me, and we can note that there's an Inuit sounding name to it, that suggests the shift of power to that area, where presumably a less polluted environment is the basis for a new locus of economic power. And the names of those participating in the symposium represent broad ethnicity. So Marianne Crescent Moon and Johnny Running Dog are people of importance at the conference, suggesting a new authority for Native peoples. Right? And this is also important in Canadian literature and the Canadian psyche, because there has been a lot of trauma against the Indigenous by Canadians, just as in the US, and they're trying to account for it and come to terms with it. So it's interesting for Atwood to kind of reformulate that world where the Indigenous have reclaimed some sort of element of power. And a main speaker is James Darcy Peixoto of Cambridge University, and other speakers include Notley Wade, also of Cambridge, Gopal Chatterjee of India, and Sieglinde van Buren of the Republic of Texas, right? So that's interesting too. It's more evidence of a shift of power. Texas would really love that in their debates, right? To finally become a republic, as they've talked about. So James Darcy Peixoto's name is a combination of an Anglo and a non-Anglo Portuguese name, and a misspelling of that. And it's been argued widely that the Darcy is harkening back to Jane Austen's hero in Pride and Prejudice, so Mr. Darcy, right? Fitzwilliam Darcy. And so that surname is clearly non-Anglo, also with Peixoto. And the names in the notes suggest a cosmopolitanism and apparently a new egalitarianism, but as we can see, there's a great deal of evidence that the values and attitudes that made Gilead possible still prevail, right? The assumptions and prejudices of the speakers at the symposium are revealed through the same old sexist jokes and puns on Tale, the Handmaid's Tale, and Chasing Tale, and what that means, or the Arctic char and chair, the joke at her expense. Um, it even that tale pervasively like runs through, and the construction of Offred and her narrative also render her as object. She's objectified at that symposium. There's also a depressingly familiar aura to the academic setting, which is characterized by jostling for power and influence, and worst of all, moral obtuseness, as in the name of intellectual detachment. Peixoto enjoins his listeners to, quote, not to judge, but to understand, thus noting the contradiction between the names and the realities that we find in the historical notes. Um, not hope for a future of greater justice and equality, but rather a perpetuation of our own flawed beliefs and attitudes. So Atwood uses names to show the cyclical nature of male female oppression and history repeating itself. And what happened in biblical times has been repeated many times throughout history and can be expected to recur in the future, because she also uses a lot of biblical names that I didn't go into. But certainly, you can go into it. There's a really great article that I'm going to reference here at the end, by Charlotte Templin, called Names and Naming: Tell an Archetypal Story in Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. And you can read more about the biblical aspects of it. So, naming is a discursive feature woven throughout Atwood's novel and contributes significantly to the novel's effect. Right, so names in The Handmaid's Tale carry much more than the usual symbolism. Therefore, research into the meaning of names in The Handmaid's Tale is more than this kind of like exercise with little relevance to the major features of the text. Names point to the central meanings in the history, or the story, excuse me. So the use of names contributes significantly to the construction of an archetypal tale of oppression and suffering, victimizer and victimized. Atwood's example suggests that literary onomastics is indeed of critical importance to the study of language and literature. And so it's important in a lot of ways to think about, naming, and to then say my name. What is my name? Where it's treasured, and to use that. And I actually even use the title Say My Name because that harkens back to a newly released memoir that came out about the Stanford sexual assault that had occurred at Stanford University. So, in reference to that, and I should say the is not Say My Name, but Know My Name by Chanel Miller. And so she finally revealed herself as that Emily Doe in the case, People versus Turner, against Brock Turner, and her sexual assault case in which she had not come forward. And then she includes that experience as being, quote, the unconscious, intoxicated woman, end quote, the trial, the sentencing from that judge. And what that looked like, for better for worse, because if you look at it, there's a lot of debates about whether the judge was appropriate or not. But what's interesting is that she titled that memoir that just came out in 2019, Know My Name, colon, a memoir. And it is this idea of like, to know one's name is to bring power and location into oneself. And even renaming. Imagine that also with trans identity, for instance, when you're changing a name to reflect gender fluidity and kind of that self-selection of purpose, of personhood, excuse me. So that's also um, significant. So, continuing on here, in the fifth and final takeaway, there are a series of slides with this: feminism, this kind of struggle between post feminism and second wave feminism. This is really interesting here in the narrative because you can see this with the flashbacks in the relationship between Offred and her mother. And like what is being talked about there is kind of this fictional exploration of the tension between these feminisms at a time in the 1980s when a lot of references are coming out about thinking about women in the workforce and women in their roles with family, etc. So, The Handmaid's Tale is not just this critique of a theocracy and the rising popularity of right wing sentiments from the Christian right at the time that Margaret Atwood is writing, but also a response to a crisis in the feminist movement. And that's an important takeaway about this text. Less radical than their mothers' generation, second wave feminist daughters veered to the right, aided by those media that declared a post feminist era and whose cover stories consistently reiterated women's failure to find husbands, get pregnant, or properly bond with their children. So, the absence of real women in a news account that is allegedly about a real woman is a hallmark of 80s backlash journalism. So there are like critics who have found this to be the case, and in fact, you can look at this in an article I referenced, Newman's Just a Backlash: Margaret Atwood, Feminism, and the Handmaid's Tale, as well as um, Iwelina Feldman Kolozhuk's Mothers, Daughters, Sisters, The Intergenerational Transmission of Womanhood, and Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale and the Testaments, um, as well as Aisha Matthews's Gender Ontology and the Power of the Patriarchy, a postmodern feminist analysis of Octavia Butler's Wild Seed and Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. And there's a comparison there. And I have them at the end of the slide. So the end of this presentation so that you can see those sources. But it's interesting because these critics had gone through and looked at it, and they had noted that the absence of real women in a news account that allegedly about real women as a hallmark of 80s backlash journalism, the press had delivered the backlash to the public through a series of trend stories articles that claimed to divine sweeping shifts in female social behavior while providing little in the way of evidence to support their generalizations. Like, this is the kind of moment that it's coming out of, these like trend in stories that repeatedly showed professional women as torn between their career and children, or that they're plagued by infertility problems, that has become an epidemic. And so this is what kind of gives rise to these questions in the 80s and ongoing today. And certainly there have been connections between climate change and infertility, or at least in dystopian narratives. In fact, I will say I just caught a new show called The Commons that is an Australian co production with, I believe, the BBC. And it's really well done. Um, and it's kind of looking at this quest for womanhood in this not too far off future where climate change is like really wreaking havoc, particularly in Australia. And we certainly can cite the recent fires in the past few years as like decimating the ecology, the landscape, and the animal population of Australia because of climate change. And so you have this kind of near future dystopian environment where, fertility is a central question in this show. So again, it's called The Commons. It's really interesting if you can check it out. I think I caught it through my subscription to AMC and Sundance. So at the time of writing in the 80s, to go back to that time, televangelists were rising to fame and power. And they had proclaimed that feminists encourage women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. Like, this is a kind of like reductive quote that you can find. And Newman talks about this in her article that I posted online on Canvas already. So, since media coverage often portrayed feminists primarily as single, man hating, and child killing militants, it's hardly surprising that their daughters' generation could no longer identify with that movement. And so a new ideal for women arose, embodied by Phyllis Schlafly, author of The Power of the Positive Woman, published in 1977. This work was really making the rounds during Atwood's time, and she was thinking about this and kind of commenting on it. So Schlafly, who is now generally recognized as the face of anti-feminism, exhorted women to embrace gender differences and make the most of them in the 70s and 80s. And she was the founder of the STOP era. So, STOP, the Equal Rights Amendment movement, which strongly opposed the ratification of the amendment to guarantee equal legal rights for all American citizens, regardless of gender. So while supporters of the era, who were predominantly members of women's liberation movements, sought the eradication of those gendered rules and norms that confined women to a life within the home, its antagonists, like Schlafly, claimed that women were, quote, destined to be wives and mothers, and their domestic roles actually freed them from the drudgeries and dangers of the office, the factory, and the military, among other male dominated venues. So again, it's an interesting take because it puts the onus of like men's, misogyny onto women. Like, well, we can't seem to stop this misogyny, so we're going to just reduce you to the home, right? And you're going to have to go back into the home, which is how this interplays or goes back into a Saudi Arabian example to a degree. It's still kind of, women are still allowed to do things, but even more so recently, as opposed to the Iranian example, where even if this is an issue, women were still allowed in the workforce because it's like, well, as long as you comply with state rules, you're allowed to do all the things that you want to do, which again is akin to more Soviet era rules about women in the workforce and participation. So that's, again, I take that back there because it's just not a clear example. And so many people want to read it as like, okay, as I read this, this is also about 1979 Iran, and it's not. But it is, interestingly enough, about 1979 America and the kinds of battles that are being played out in the media regarding women's roles. So, in her public addresses, as well as in her writing, Shafley advocated the traditional role division of working husbands and stay at home wives, with single women mostly relegated to the posts of teachers and nurses, as the school child or the patient of any age provides an outlet for a woman to express her natural maternal need. And that was a quote, excuse me, at the end there. So the quote is: the school child or the patient of any age provides an outlet for a woman to express her natural maternal need. And Shafley declares that the positive woman looks upon her, quote, femaleness and fertility as part of her purpose, her potential, and her power. She rejoices that she has a capability for creativity that men can never have. Um, and Atwood, taking these presumptions to the extreme, constructs the world of The Handmaid's Tale, in which fertility is a rather dubious power. So, at the heart of post feminism lay the resentment that equal opportunities, the goal of second wave feminism, meant more work, responsibilities, and incessant frustration, and not being able to reconcile childcare and career. And so, post feminists accuse their mothers of having been sacrificed at the altar of their feminist struggle, which can be summed up in the following ways: in pursuit of one's independence, one sacrificed me, or the daughter is saying this to the mother, in pursuit of your independence, you sacrificed me as well. You didn't give me enough love, right? You didn't give me I'm sorry, you didn't give me enough love, enough care, enough time. You were always in a hurry and often tired. You thought the quality of the time you spent with me was more important than the quantity. The truth is, I was not your top priority and you were not a good mother. I won't do the same with my children. I mean, this was a common reaction in interviews of women, um, of like second wave feminists, for instance, of like the daughters of second wave feminists. And this approach and simultaneously reproach is evident in the relationship between Offred and her activist mother, who was always involved in some scheme, rushing to a rally or a meeting. In one of the moments, Offred recalls lying in her bedroom at the commander's house is that of a promised walk in the park with her mother. She said, quote, we were going to feed the ducks, but there were some women burning books. That's what she was really there for. And to see her friends, she lied to me. Saturdays were supposed to be my day. I turned away from her, sulking towards the ducks. Right. So we know that there's that kind of resentment. So always busy fighting for the cause, Offred's mother obviously believed in the notion of quality time, making up the rest of the week's inattention on Saturdays. However, even on those days, she found it hard to resist the temptation of joining her friends and burning pornographic magazines. So unsurprisingly, motherhood, was a particularly difficult decision for second wave feminists, as it was generally considered to be the main source of oppression in women's lives. So some activists went so far as to treat this choice in terms of betrayal of the movement. Furthermore, single parenthood, though no longer carrying the stigma of past days, was not a widespread phenomenon either. Offred's mother attests to that. I had you, and she says this is a quote, I had you when I was 37. My mother said, it was a risk. You could have been deformed or something. You were a wanted child, all right. And I did get shit from some quarters. My oldest buddy, Trisha Foreman, accused me of being pronatalist, the bitch, and stuff about how hard it was to be a single parent. At the hospital, they wrote down aged primipara on the chart. I caught them in the act. That's what they call you when it's your first baby over 30. Over 30, for God's sakes, she says this. So, becoming a mother, a woman suddenly becomes a national resource, to use Offred's bitter expression. Doctors, psychologists, sociologists, and politicians proclaim that what is good and what is bad for prospective mothers, and at what age she should bear children. So later they determine how she should raise and feed the baby so that it grows up to be, depending on the current trend, a perfect or perfectly happy citizen. And this is interesting because this text comes at a really great place in our reading because it harkens back to Herland and thinking through the prescription for raising children, or really any book that we had read thus far in the utopian literature about raising children and what that society looks like. But it also relates really well to The Machine Stops, our next reading, that looks at the separation of children, or how children are kind of given up to the machine and the state in a particular way and even dispersed across the world and not necessarily raised by by their parents. In fact, we see no precedent in The Machine Stops that they were raised by their parents. So it's really fascinating to kind of look at this attention that is paid to motherhood and this relationship between parents and child, and even the parentification that children might take on as becoming parents for themselves in the way that they are isolated, right? Like we kind of see that with Offred, the parentification, because she doesn't have this clear mother who's invested in her, starting to take care of herself in that psychological process. So, um, so we know that there's this attention paid to raising. These are the attitudes of Offred's mother's generation of women combated, and were therefore generation of women who were combated and then were therefore deeply disappointed when their daughters decided to glorify motherhood and the feminine. And unlike second wave feminists who strongly accentuated the similarities between the sexes and urged gender equality, post feminists took pride in the feminine and their biological uniqueness. A woman's body became the source of primeval power that manifested itself through menstruation and pregnancy and childbirth, for instance. And I still have so much more to say about this, right? So, in terms of like kinship relationships, unlike her mother, who had her at the age of 37, Offred gave birth to a daughter at the age of 25, and the main narrative is related by a 33-year-old Offred who has been separated from her 8-year-old daughter for 3 years and has no knowledge of her offspring's whereabouts, and thus the protagonist's experience of motherhood can be divided into a 5-year period of direct mothering and a 3-year period of child deprivation. The reader does not learn that Offred is a mother until page 49, roughly, when the memory of Offred's mother prompts the memory of having her daughter abducted, and the juxtaposition of the reminiscences of her mother with those of the daughter is hardly coincidental and should be read in terms of intergenerational transmission. So the mother and the daughter always serve as a woman's double, someone she once was and someone she might become. As Carl Jung notes, quote, every mother contains her daughter in herself and every daughter her mother, and every woman extends backwards into her mother and forwards into her daughter, end quote. But in The Handmaid's Tale, intergenerational transmission of motherhood or womanhood is disrupted since Offred's daughter is appropriated by the system allegedly for her own good. She's in good hands, they said, with people who are fit. You are unfit, but you want the best for her, don't you? Right? So this was the explanation for her to be co-opted and taken from her. But we also know in this world of postmodern feminism that womanhood is further questioned and looked at, right? So postmodern feminism questions the psychological and linguistic aspects of gender identity. That are often assumed to be natural. As such, postmodern feminism resists gender essentialism, or that belief that gender identity organically arises from some inherent physical or psychological qualities in one biological sex or the other. Or it can, I guess, to some degree, um, it can be seen that it questions these kinds of notions as well, right? Like in some ways, it can, um, I'm sorry, differentiate that there's a third term here. So there's the post feminism, right, versus the second wave feminism, and then there's postmodern feminism, right? So I just want to make sure to highlight this because the most modern feminists are now coming to counter in the post feminists. And that is really huge to differentiate because the postmodern feminists are resisting the post feminists, right? They're resisting that gender essentialism or the belief that gender identity is organically fixed or arises from some inherent physical or psychological quality or in one biological sex or the other. And you can see that today, particularly when we're talking about trans identity. So it attempts to resist un unvocalization or the tendency to produce one unifying narrative at the expense of the diversity of women's experiences, holding several often contradictory ways of thinking, being and assigning meaning to an individual lives simultaneously, thereby rejecting the premise of fixed or predetermined gender identities. So post modern feminism can definitely have contradictions, and it's also a term that's really helpful to think about. So you can also think about this in relation to, for instance, Judith Butler's work, Performativity Trouble, Postmodern Feminism, and Essential Subjects, wherein the categories of gender, sex, and the self are not expressive of our bodies or natures. Rather, they are merely the results of socially governed performances. So gender is not expressed but done, right? Thus, if gender is performed, not essential, it stands to reason that assumptions about women's nature are fundamentally lacking. In fact, there can be no one woman's nature, no inherent subject standpoint. Still, the bodies we wear and the rules and restrictions applied to them by our participation in society do immeasurably color the experiences we have and ultimately shape the worldviews with which we identify. So, here I have the quote. Finally, we get to the slide of Offred's affair with her commander, a wholly illicit relationship that progresses. And she expressed during that time, quote, "We are for breeding purposes. We aren't concubines, geisha girls, courtesans. On the contrary, everything possible has been done to remove us from that category. There is supposed to be nothing entertaining about us. No room is to be permitted for the flowering of secret lust. We're two-legged wombs, that's all, sacred vessels, ambulatory chalices." Which is interesting here. I mean, there has been a lot of debate of whether or not they are concubines and actually seen as such, but she's talking about the sexual gratification as being taken out of that, right? Particularly, we can see this with this triangle between Serena Joy and the commander, and then also Offred. So, whatever womanhood used to mean, defined at once by Offred's liberated and opinionated mother, her rebellious college friend Moira, and her own short lived motherhood, it holds a different meaning now in the present for her. The women of Gilead are expected to aspire to forms of subjectivity that are the definition of traditional gender roles to an almost farcical extent. And all worthy women in Gilead must aspire to emptiness of mind. As they say, what we prayed for was emptiness, so we would be worthy to be filled with grace, with love, and with self denial, semen, and babies, as she said at another point. And so the imagery of women as empty vessels is biblical in origin, you could argue, but remains pervasive in traditionalist inscriptions of gender performance. Not only do the men of Gilead perceive these traits as essentially female, but the women also begin to internalize them as proper and natural in the vein of the aforementioned analogy about racial difference. Thus, the women are even harder on one another than the men are on the women, right? They've internalized these kind of misogynistic elements. But whether it is out of self pity and a desire to control, possessiveness of one sphere of domestic influence, or a genuine belief in loyalty, the phallocentrism espoused by the Bible, the women, or you could argue that it is, and it's co opted here, the women take it upon themselves to police one another's behavior, suggesting that if one woman is not free, no woman shall be. And that is something that we definitely see replicated by societies that have regimes and women who are part of controlling those regimes, right? Like we saw that within the Nazi Party, we saw that within the Soviet era and the Soviet bloc. We've seen that also, in various different, kind of components. Definitely coming back to the Iranian Revolution context, women are definitely involved in policing other women and what they wear and whatnot, and being part of the comité where they are patrolling the streets and are able to, in some way, regulate that. So, or regulate society and women. So, It's interesting to think about also the twisted triangle between Offred, Serena Joy, and their commander as a perversion of traditional marriage. And we look at the motif of marriage, right? And it's actually trying to draw on the biblical narrative literally between Rachel, Jacob, and Bilhah. Um, and you could see that, and it's invoked throughout the text, but we know it's this like perversion of it, this exacerbation of the text. So it's definitely, you can trace these biblical elements throughout the narrative, particularly in reference to what Atwood was talking about, the sphere of the religious right. But you can also argue that they collapse in on themselves. They're not meant to be accurate. Um, that they're just kind of co-opted as a lens and then presented as hyperbole. So marriage within The Handmaid's Tale becomes less of a matter of reproductive unity and more of a matter of social signification, by the way. In terms of that hierarchical piece that I mentioned before, what are the hierarchies? In a marriage, absent of sexual desire, fertility, and domestic responsibility, which of or it is absent, so it effectively contracts out the woman's work to the other established groups like the Marthas, the aunts, and marriage becomes a union entirely enacted through symbolic gestures and demonstrations of power. So as Offred learns quite quickly upon entering Serena Joy's house, as for my husband, she said, he's just that, my husband. I want that to be perfectly clear till death do us part. It's final, right? So it's like my, think about that word, that possession, that reversal, that inherited kind of like patriarchal or misogynistic viewpoint of like, let's create objects out of the people within the story. The commander, he's my possession, he's my husband. And it's staking that claim because we know there's this intervention here. So, despite her unsatisfactory sex life and futile mimicry of domestic responsibility, Serena Joy's marriage functions as a sign of status and a validation of womanly values. The possessiveness, jealousy, and venom that exists between Serena Joy and Offred further signifies the danger of internalizing patriarchal values. When womanhood and womanliness are defined solely by patriarchal standards, those definitions of femininity must be fiercely protected, with each woman fighting ferociously for her own domestic sovereignty and supremacy over the other woman. Because marriage is not about love here, but about reproducing scripturally suitable familial units, the feelings of validation long sought by many women can no longer find fulfillment within this world. And so, finally, as a last motif here, when we're looking at all of these different feminisms, motherhood. The motif of motherhood is also interesting to note. In the vein of reproductive slavery, The Handmaid's Tale presents an even more oppressive vision of motherhood as the handmaids are forced to conceive, carry, and deliver babies that they will never get to raise. The structure of the nuclear family in Gilead facilitates a power struggle as women separated by domestic function must fight to find self worth and self definition solely through narrowly envisioned social roles. So the Marthas are homely and therefore serve as maids and servants, taking the traditionally wifely role as housekeeper, and so they scorn the handmaids for their position as breeders. The wives serve as female figureheads, receiving all of the praise for the family's production of a child and becoming said child's true and only mother. The babies are sacred objects of worship, commodified and brandished like trophies. To make matters worse, handmaids must conceive a child within 2 years or face exile to the colonies that are nuclear wastelands not fit for human survival, where those declared unwomen are sent to work and die. So Janine, having done her duty to the Republican or commander, is assured that she will, quote, never be sent to the colonies. She'll never be declared unwoman. That is her reward, end quote. And thus reproduction is used in Atwood's text, much like it is in other kinds of dystopian narratives, to intimidate, coerce, and define women, to control female behavior, and to influence female self-identity. And so in a post-modern feminist sense, the biblical determinism reinstated in Gilead once again underscores the socially constructed nature of motherhood. So, unlike wifedom, which does not entail a biological component, Motherhood often collapses the distinction between the physical and the psychological attributes of reproduction, conflating the biological imperative to reproduce with some concept of female identity. When speaking to Offred about the construction of Gilead society, her commander argues, quote, and here is the quote here on the slide. "We've given them more than we've taken away," said the commander. "Think of the trouble they had before. Don't you remember the terrible gap between the ones who could get a man easily and the ones who couldn't? This way they all get a man, nobody's left out. Money was the only measure of worth for everyone. They got no respect as mothers. This way they're protected and they can fulfill their biological destinies in peace. What did we overlook?" Right? And this is a really seminal scene between them. And clearly, the commanders of Gilead overlook the importance, as Offred points out, of free will and self selected identity in their assessment of the Republic's success. The phallocentric belief that all women secretly want to be mothers above all else, and that finding a man is the most pressing imperative in a woman's life, is demonstrably responsible for a large part of motherhood's oppressiveness. So, in addition to the character requirements demanded within this framework, kindness, nurture, empathy, endurance, and humility, the substitution of individual identity for that of a mother is assumed. The self effacement implied in quote unquote true motherhood shuts out any other opportunities for self identification. Um, and when supported by a patriarchal system that determines woman's destiny from her biological fate, a truly horrific society emerges here, right? So, to conclude, to bring it together, Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale explores the ontological positions occupied by the respective novels as protagonists and vocalizes the impact of hegemonic patriarchal discourse and social structures on female subjectivity, objectivity, repression, representation, and the potential for subversion. And tales of mothers and daughters are inevitably inscribed in the intergenerational pattern of transmission, assuming that the mother is a pivotal point of reference for the daughter's identity formation. While the notion of womanhood received by the daughter from her maternal parent is affected by personal experience and circumstances, it is also representative of the mother's generation of women. Such is the case for Offred and her radical feminist mother, whose tale demonstrates the conflict between second wave feminists and their post feminist daughters. So, in terms of slides here, and the image I chose is from the TV show of The Wall, right? We can imagine this is the Harvard Yard, where this has now become co-opted as the site for justice. But I thought it was apropos here to end on. These are some articles that I found really compelling that I've posted online for you on the Canvas page. Gender Ontology and the Power of the Patriarchy by Aisha Matthews. Names and Naming Tell an Archetypal Story in Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale by Charlotte Templin. As I mentioned before, Iwelina Feldman Claude Joux's Mothers, Daughters, Sisters, The Intergenerational Transmission of Womanhood, and Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale and the Testaments, and her newest text that's come out. S.C. Newman's Just a Backlash, Margaret Atwood Feminism, and The Handmaid's Tale is a really important article on which a lot of folks use. And they draw on. And then lastly, Dominic M. Grace's The Handmaid's Tale Historical Notes and Documentary Subversion is a really interesting article about forms. So thank you so much for patiently bearing with me in this lecture on The Handmaid's Tale. I hope that gives you some food for thought and thinking through some of these misogynistic overtones throughout the narrative. Where can we find them today? But in thinking through some of these themes, I hope that you can examine like what rings true, what doesn't ring true, again, as hyperbole and exaggeration, or even just a warning about a dystopian world to come.